We are, during our Sunday evenings this summer, looking at some lessons on the Old Testament. Lessons that are designed in a very brief sort of way to summarize the main story, the main teaching of the Old Testament. As I indicated, these are lessons that, for the most part, are simply part of some class material that I present over at Florida College in a class on Old Testament history and geography. It's something I kind of avoid doing a lot of the time because we often have students here who hear all the same thing in class, and so I don't often do that. But I thought this summer it might be a good thing to try to extract from that some lessons that we would use to summarize some of the main core teachings of the Old Testament itself, and especially to see how the Old Testament leads us to the New Testament and to Christ and to salvation by faith in Christ. Now, thus far, all of the lessons that we've looked at have been what I think you might say sort of predictable. We looked at the account of creation in Genesis 1. Nobody be surprised if we were going to summarize the Old Testament that we would look at Genesis 1 and the account of creation. Or as we looked at Genesis 3 and the beginning of sin, and we made the point that really after that all of the rest of the Bible is focused on the redemption of man from sin. And we can say that that's the theme of the Bible. Genesis 12 certainly doesn't surprise anybody that is familiar at all with the Old Testament because there we learn of the promise to Abraham. And we see how that promise would really determine all of the rest of the Bible. The rest of the Bible will be focused on the descendants of Abraham, the seed through whom salvation would come, focused on the land that God promised and gave to Abraham as the place where that plan of salvation would be carried out. And of course focused on Abraham himself as the father of the faithful and the promise to him. Likewise, when we looked at the Passover, that too is not surprising because we recognize that in that slaying of the Passover lamb, we have really the basic principles of salvation being set forth that we would find in the sacrifice of Christ as our Passover lamb. And certainly last Sunday, as we looked at the Ten Commandments, well, how are you going to summarize or study the Old Testament without taking a look at the Ten Commandments? That most fundamental part of the law of Moses that God spoke to the children of Israel there at Mount Sinai. But if all of those passages were predictable, tonight's, I think, is probably not so predictable.